Okay, next I want to talk about brushes, watercolour brushes. There's a whole series of different types of watercolour brushes, and largely they fall into rounds and flats, or rounds and chisel edge, depending on how you know them. So the first lot are the round brushes. So these are all rounds. The brush that I'd recommended to you was a number 8. That's a number 8 brush. It's a Taklon brush, so it's a synthetic brush. They're reasonably priced. They last quite well. That's number 8 there as well. They're from Zart Art. You can get them from a variety of places. So they're good all-purpose size brush, not too big, not too small. You can see this one's slightly larger, so that's a little bit bigger. That's a number 10. So it's a number 10 Taklon. It's a nice, again, a nice size brush. That one's a number 12, so that's a good bit larger. But again, a Taklon brush looking, it's had better days. And then on the smaller size, we've got a number 6 there. Well, yeah, number 6, and we've got what's probably, yeah, a 4. Now that goes right down to a 1, so, you know, really, really fine brush, but we really don't need it. For the purposes of what we're doing, that number 8 is terrific. Then we've got the flat brushes, and there's a variety, again, a variety of sizes in the flats. So you've got this kind of flat brush, that's a 6. Now this one's got a very long, you'll notice it's got a very long brush length compared to that one. So that just means that it's going to have more spread when you're actually painting. It's quite nice. One thing that's worth pointing out with this one is you can see that the paint has chipped off the handle. That's a sure sign that this brush has been left in water. So when you leave a brush in water that's quite deep like that, what's going to happen is that water's going to track up the brush, and it's going to cause that to come off. So really good tip, don't leave brushes in water, and if they are left in, make sure that they're only up to the metal part like that. So that's a lovely brush, very usable. That's a fairly standard smaller size, and then you can see these two are larger. So nice for doing a broader wash where you want to wet a larger area. This brush is a bit different because this one's got a tapered, a rounded edge. So it's going to give you more like a round brush, the shape when you're doing that. So it's more like that, but still with the benefits of the flat brush. So flat brushes are really good for getting a lot of liquid down. There are other flat brushes that you can use. I love this one. I use this a lot. This is a Renoir Wide Flow. It's called a Wide Flow. So it's lovely and soft, but you can really get a lot of water down quickly. And this one's a ripper. This is called the Palmer by Dynasty. And this brush is, so it's 50 millimeters wide. So it's really wide. It's got that tapered edge. But you can get a very wide wash down very easily, and it's very comfortable to hold. So it's an interesting idea of that, just, and hence the name Palmer is that you're holding it in your palm. So there's two other chisel-edged or flat-edged brushes. You then have some other types of brushes. This one is known as a rigger's brush. So it's got a very long, very long brush. Now that's because a rigger's brush will hold fluid for a long time, so you're able to draw a very long fluid line, and it's lovely for making very fluid marks, and I'll use it later on. This one's been in my pencil case, unfortunately, and it's got a bit of a kink going on there, which is a shame, but yeah, lovely brush. So rigger's brush, also known as liner brush. So some people call them a liner brush, and some people call them a rigger's brush. Fan brush. So a fan brush, fanning out, smoothing, softening areas. So again, a specialty brush. This one's a sort of handmade brush, and this one's animal hair. So it behaves differently in the way that it holds the hair, just a completely different feel to a synthetic brush. And lastly, a fantastic thing, these are made by Pentel, but there's lots of different brands out there. It's basically a water brush, and indispensable for being out if you were painting the landscape. So basically you're able to take the lid off, fill it up with water, or it could be coloured ink, I suppose, but generally water. And then you're able just to squeeze a drop out, and just grab something to paint on, and you can paint with it. So it's and you can apply pressure to it to make it more watery. So you can see, oh, that's more watery. So you can squeeze more water out. Really handy, handy brush. Well worthwhile. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about are papers. And there are a number of different types of papers that you can use for watercolour. And it's probably going to be fairly difficult to see any kind of real difference. First one's a heavyweight cartridge. Now you've got a heavyweight cartridge in your pack, and this is good for just getting the hang of using watercolour because it's cheaper. The lighter weight cartridge like that one, so if you compare, this is a lot stiffer than that one. So the lighter weight cartridge is going to, the surface is going to pill up a little bit. It's going to collapse fairly easily. So certainly the heavyweight cartridge would be your minimum. If you tried to do it with photocopy paper, you're going to drill a hole through the paper and it's going to peel up really quickly and be quite problematic. The best results are gained by using proper watercolour paper. And watercolour paper has what's called a tooth, so a surface on it. And it has a back and front, which everybody has trouble figuring out. Basically, there's a uniform pattern, which is the back, and a less uniform pattern, which is the front. So this piece of paper here is a cold pressed watercolour paper. So you've got hot pressed and cold pressed paper, and I'll just show you a hot pressed paper. This one is a hot pressed paper, and it's very smooth. So I always say to students, think of it as hot pressed as if it's been ironed. It's gone through a press under heat, as opposed to cold pressed paper, which has no heat and therefore has more surface or more tooth. So that's the difference between hot pressed and cold pressed. The third type of paper, just find one. I don't know if you can see that well enough, is rough. So this is a paper that's got a really rough, you can hear it, a really rough surface. So when you use a paintbrush on there with watercolour, the brush adheres to the liquid adheres to the top of the surface, and you get white sitting underneath the surface. So it's a very different effect from the other two. A little bit harder to manage, but interesting all the same. So you've all got a kit of various watercolour papers, and it's important for you to recognise the difference between the watercolour papers and the cartridge papers. And the way to tell is the colour. So the colour of, there is a third paper actually, is that one there, which is a mixed media paper, and it's got a manufactured surface on the front and not on the back. So it's a lower end watercolour paper, or just general purpose paper. So you've got those, and they're predominantly a creamy sort of colour, as opposed to the cartridge paper, which is quite white. Can you see? Hopefully you can see the difference between the two. So use your watercolour papers first because they're lesser papers, and you can also use the pages in your visual journal as well for that initial practicing. And that way, when you get on to using these papers, they'll feel really good. They'll feel so much better because you will have been using a poorer surface to begin with. So it's good to hold off on that. One other thing is you can also buy watercolour paper in pads like this. This is an unusual shape, but what the big deal with this is that each page is glued down, so I can't lift that. And what you do is you do your watercolour painting on the pad, and then when you finish the painting, you can get in here somewhere and put like a ruler underneath, and you can tear that off. And the idea of that is that keeps that surface really flat, so it doesn't warp and buckle, and it gives you a flat surface to be able to work on, and then you're tearing it off. So that's another approach that you can use. Generally, buying watercolour paper this way is more expensive, so a watercolour pad is more expensive than buying a large sheet of watercolour paper